Everyone has heard of a species of animal: African lion, grey wolf, giant panda, cat bear. But there's a problem. There kind of aren't any species of animal. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the term species, and if asked, could name a variety of animal species. But what is a species? Well, in biology, a species is defined as a group of organisms who look similar, show the same behaviour, fulfil the same ecological niche, and more importantly, are able to breed and produce fertile offspring. Seems simple enough. Some of you may have heard of subspecies. For example, all these different kinds of giraffe. A subspecies is less easily defined though. They tend to look a little different from the rest of the species, are geographically isolated to a specific area, may show slightly different behaviours. However, they fulfil the same ecological niche as the other subspecies and can breed with individuals of these other subspecies and produce fertile offspring. In terms of conservation value, my view on the concept of subspecies is confusing. If your goal is to keep the world as it is now, subspecies aren't actually that important. If your goal is to keep the ecosystems and processes running how they were and let the natural world do its own thing, then subspecies are arguably very important. The thing is though, when you start looking at the definitions closely, when trying to identify a subspecies for example, you come across a problem. How do you draw the line and say this is where one species stops and the other starts? When you look at fossils, do you define these two skeletons as the same species even though they were found thousands of miles away from each other? Because when you look at skeletons of different species of leopards, they all look the same, just different sizes, but then could be different ages? This is part of the species problem. The species problem, as with many other important things regarding animals, starts with Charles Darwin. Hundreds of years ago, the term species was just used as a method to describe a specific kind of organism until 1686, when British naturalist John Ray introduced the concept that a specific species will always produce the same species when they breed. Then in the early 1700s, Carolus Linnaeus formalised the use of the taxonomic rank and two-part naming system we still use today, under the assumption that a species is fixed. Now, Darwin rocks up to the scene and releases his famous book On the Origin of Species in 1859, and begins to offer an explanation of how species evolve over time. He didn't give any details on how a species could become two species, known as speciation, but he did suggest it is a gradual process. But now we have a problem. If species are changing over time, evolving, which they are, then there must be a period of time, as a new species is forming, where they aren't different enough to be recognised as a new species. One could argue that's what a subspecies is, but then all species that have existed in the past and will exist in the future are all in comparison to the single snapshot that was taken when we started to label our living species around us. The process of evolution is so slow that if you could sit and just watch the generations of a baboon go by, you wouldn't notice a difference because it's so subtle until you compared the animal directly to one from 1,000 generations before. Genetically, there may not be much difference, but it looks different and behaves a bit differently. So is it now a new species, or is it still the species of baboon you started watching thousands of generations ago? It's starting to get really confusing. There are different ways to try and understand a species. In many ways, it's up to you to define what a species means to you, because it actually gets quite philosophical when you get down to it. One way to think of it, as biologist Ernst Mayr suggests, is that a species is a very real, quantifiable thing that exists even without a lot of human reasoning. His argument for this is that in New Guinea, tribesmen with a Stone Age culture have identified 136 different species of birds. Visiting ornithologists from the West independently came to recognise also 136 different species of birds. So, if a species was a purely arbitrary thing, it would be very unlikely for two groups of people to reach the same conclusion independently. However, it could be argued that all humans are wired in the same way to see the same patterns and create these groups in the same way anyway. Another way to think of it is simply, species are just names that us humans have given groups of organisms, but the line that is drawn between species is not based on any underlying biological cutoff point. This can easily be considered when you start to look at the way many subspecies are named or designated. But an argument against this is that a species isn't a type. A species is actually an individual. These individuals would still exist separate to anything else, whether or not anyone was there to observe it and name it or not. A third way of looking at it, and personally my way of looking at it, is this. Suggested by the philosophers Philip Kitcher and John Dupuy, species don't exist as natural kinds, as a real structure of the natural world. However, they are conceptually real for practical application, for example, measuring biodiversity in a region. It's better to say there are 3,000 flying squirrels, 1,500 gibbons, a healthy population of sika deer, but our snakes are suffering, than saying we have 4,500 furry tree things, a healthy population of furry ground things, but some of our scaly things are suffering, specifically the ones that have no legs. But really, it is us, and the way our minds work, that is the reason for the problem with species. Firstly, we want to categorise and identify organisms. As mentioned before, it is needed for scientific measurements and for educating people about all animals, really. So we teach and understand species as natural kinds, a structural part of the natural world. But as a biologist wanting to understand evolutionary processes, the term species becomes muddy and unusable. This should be where you are starting to see why teaching people about evolution, while at the same time explaining a species is a structural part of nature, can get confusing, and it's not a surprise so many people have trouble understanding the concept of evolution. Then you have some species like the Aldabra rail, who has the gall to pop up in the news and cause a lot of confusion in people's heads by going extinct 136,000 years ago and yet suddenly reappearing and evolving again 100,000 years ago. I'm not going to go into the detail about how that happens, but it's really interesting and you should definitely look it up. But it does highlight a bit of the problem around the idea of species. I will, however, end with this. Species aren't a fixed structure within the natural world, so perhaps it's more important to conserve the ecosystems that allow these individuals to occur rather than focus on maintaining a specific animal. And while you work on maintaining an ecosystem, you'll be supporting all of the species, or whatever they are, within it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Ring the notification bell so you can always be up to date whenever I post a new video. And why not share it with your friends? Bye!